I was hoping that my coffee would be ready.
I understand. Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm here with Spencer Leonard, and we are talking about his two collective volumes of Marxist journalism. First one, Marx and Engels on Bonapartism, and the second one is Marx and Engels on Imperialism. And as you stated in your introduction to both books, that Bonapartism and imperialism and Marx and Engels are almost interchangeable in the way they're used. Can you talk about specifically what they meant by it and why they were interchangeable?
Sure. Well, the Bonapartism and imperialism are interchangeable in the usage of liberals. I mean, there were other terms that were used, but these were the ones that were really landed on. So other terms that you'll see are, for instance, Caesarism. Mm-hmm. But and that, of course, has a deep liberal basis, right? That Caesar overthrows the Republic. This kind of language was used going back into the 19th century. But the simple answer to your question, Derek, is that there was one empire in question, and that was the Second Empire of Louis Bonaparte. The term Bonapartism isn't, I mean, it captures different things, right? I mean, there are obviously different nuances to these terms. So Bonaparte is the name of a ruling house, of really a kind of royal house in European history at this point. There's a dynastic claim, obviously, being made by Louis Bonaparte. And it's in a context of competing dynastic claims. So there is the house that has ruled France since the Revolution of 1830, the so-called July Revolution, which is the House of Orleans, which is really a branch of the Bourbon, which are you'll find referred to by Marx, but Marx is just using the general terms of his day as the legitimists, the people whose claim is rooted in more traditional arguments about primogeniture in royalty. With Bonaparte, you have a claim similar to the claim of Louis Philippe, the Orleanist king, who's overthrown in 1848, in the sense that both of these houses are associated with the revolution. The House of Orleans had, if you will, acquiesced in the execution of Louis XVI, and that burnished its revolutionary credentials. The House of Bonaparte is a pure product of the revolution, in that, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte, the founder of the dynasty, had been a relatively obscure figure of a relatively obscure family, who had risen by merit through, within the Revolutionary French Army, ultimately to the leadership of those armies into, a counselor position, and ultimately to being the emperor in the beginning in 1805. 1805? Yes, I think he's crowned emperor in 1805. And in that sense, he's a product of modernity itself. The real rub is that is the ism, right? Is the way in which the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte is a kind of prototype for the rule of his nephew. And of course, Marx, has a lot to say about that. First time is tragedy, second time is farce, etc. Right? The repetition, really, of the revolution in itself, but the disintegration into imperialism, into the rule of the nephew, seems for Marx to have a different character, right? So really what he's talking about is the difference within the repetition. And in particular, the way in which the rule of Louis Bonaparte, what's tragic? Let me put it that way. What's tragic about Napoleon the Great? Arguably, and this is the argument that I think Marx accepts, the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte, even though he understands as a student of the French Revolution, and Marx is a student of the whole French Revolution, and he understands the politics under Napoleon, and it's quite complicated. And I don't want to go into all of that, but basically, the argument would be that the military defense of the revolution undertaken by Napoleon the Great and the military spread of the revolution is necessary, that it creates a Europe in the image of bourgeois society, that it creates a Europe that's, as it were, adequate to revolutionary France. And it's tragic that had to be. And it's tragic, of course, that it collapsed, that it couldn't, in a sense, complete itself in a stabilization of a sort of professedly bourgeois regime, a regime that claimed its legitimacy from the revolution rather than the counter-revolution, rather than as counter-revolution. So that's the tragedy. The farce is that the revolution of 1848 to 1851 that gives rise eventually to the coup d'etat of Louis Bonaparte is that it can't clarify its own purpose. And it disintegrates. It can't even manage its own counter-revolution. So if you read like The Class Struggles in France by Karl Marx, it's all about the inability of the Orleanists and Legitimists to, in a sense, stabilize the counter-revolution, or at least, the Republic itself is unstable and the counter-revolution is unstable. And so it takes this form of plebiscitary imperial democracy. And that's what spawns Marxist thinking, or sparks Marxist thinking around this. I mean, it's already, it's growing out of the defeat of the revolution. It's growing out of the failure of the tasks of the revolution. So you can see these ideas developing over the course of Marx's writing in 1848-49, but they grow more acute when the revolution is over. At least for Marx, it's over in the sense that he's in exile beginning in 1850, and soon he turns he turns away from the idea that the revolution will be renewed towards the recognition that the revolution is over. And he knows that, and he's arguing that to the exile community even before the coup d'etat. So I'm not really getting into the details of like a theory of Bonapartism here, Derek, but just laying some very elementary historical background. But hopefully that's good enough to get us started. And I am going to just grab my coffee now.
No problem.
Go ahead.
So one question I guess that comes to mind is, there's a whole lot of part of your introduction to both volumes, particularly the second volume, that goes through the publication history of a lot of the journalism where this discussion, outside of the Civil War in France and the Brumaire, where it's obvious in the primary thing, which those two texts are about, gets kind of bracketed out almost by the way it is presented to the public. So you mentioned in the 20th century and the English speaking world, we basically have 2 or 3 volumes, some of which are relatively recent, of Marxist journalism. And prior to that, we had to rely on the translations of the Soviet text, usually from Progress publishers, which were usually organized around like region. So like Marx is writing on Ireland, or Marx is writing on India, or
right.
What kind of misconceptions do you think organizing the work that way led to? Because it seems to be implied, at least, and maybe somewhat stated directly in your introduction, that this actually has led to some theoretical misconceptions just by the way we received the text.
Okay. I mean, so I'll just, if I may, just I'll back up just a little bit to say, you're right to point out that we have these famous texts from Marx written in German, in if you will, revolutionary form, in that they are a kind of party literature. They are written by the, let's call it, Marx-Engels party, in the sense that they're in the editorial control is in Marx's hands. He is the editor of a kind of a journal that is, a kind of periodical journal that he launches in London, called the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. My German's so bad, I'm just going to say Political Economic Review. My pronunciation's so bad. Politische Ökonomische Review. It's an heir to the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, which was his revolutionary newspaper, but it's published in the form of a journal, and that's the venue within which Class Struggles in France is published in 4 parts, and the 4th part of which he says the revolution is over. Curiously, or interestingly, he understands that in terms of economic recovery, or he poses it in those terms in the 4th part of the Class Struggles. The 18th Brumaire is the only publication that was to be part of a journal that was going to be published in other words, there was only one journal that was published, and it contained the 18th Brumaire and nothing else. But it was supposed to be a new journal that was going to be published in New York City, which at the time was something like the third largest German city in the world, and there were new Germans arriving every day from the continent. And again, in the person who published that is a figure named Joseph Wedemeyer, who's a very close member of, if you will, the Marxs Party, the heirs of the Communist League, who have split over the issue of whether the revolution is over. Schopper and Willich splitting with Marx and Engels and others on that question. So we have that, and we have a text called The Civil War in France that kind of takes these issues up 20 years later in the context of the Commune, but there's a lot of retrospective material in that where Marx really goes into the history of the Second Empire and rehearses the arguments about Bonapartism in particular in great detail there. Again, written under the editorial control of the party, if you will, in this case, of the International Working Men's Association. And of course, Marx used that party publication as it were, an act within party politics, as it was directed against Bakunin. It was a maneuver within. He willfully alienated many of his own English supporters, etc. Right? It's an act within party politics, but broadly speaking, whatever the limitations or the lack of boldness is one word he uses. He sometimes talks about how he can't speak with his accustomed boldness in the First International, but nevertheless, this is his party. He's chosen to participate within it. So these are his terms, that he's operating within. The material that I published is published by, if you will, a hostile editorial board. Mm-hmm. Not utterly hostile, because obviously they're publishing him. But it's an American newspaper. It's a Republican newspaper. Its socialism is altogether unclear. It has roots in American Fourierism, going back into communal experiments of the 1840s. The Brook Farm commune in Massachusetts is the kind of the seedbed of what becomes the New York Tribune under Horace Greeley and a kind of managing editor, Charles Dana, who is Marx's direct liaison with the newspaper. And Dana is sound as a Republican, I would say. He and Marx are both ultimately going to be fired from this newspaper over effectively the same issue, which was the adoption of revolutionary military methods in the U.S. Civil War. They were both proponents of that, and they both got fired from the Tribune for that. And so, broadly speaking, Dana was a good editor for Marx. But there are all kinds of pressures that Dana's not fully in control of on that editorial board. And some of them Marx was really quite hostile to. For instance, pro-Pan-Slavist impulses on that editorial board. Mm-hmm. But Marx is writing in English. And what I wanted to, the point that I wanted to make with these books Derek, is that, of course, I have a very political understanding of Marx. I do agree with, Engels's funeral oration, in which he says, Karl Marx was, above all, a revolutionary intellectual. He subordinated himself to the demands of the socialist workers' movement. I'd say that's really what we call, rather than talking about young Marx, mature Marx, like Marx as Marx, like, when he ceases to kind of be a student and becomes the figure that we know. For instance, Lenin puts it that way, is really Marx coming to operate within socialism. He doesn't really write anything for himself or express his own ideas. Like, we don't know what, like everything that Marx writes is commissioned by socialism, even when he doesn't have a party to commission him. He, as it were, allows himself to be commissioned by, the party that was and will be, we might say by world history, in his understanding. And that's how he tries to write for the Tribune. And he gets himself into a lot of trouble. He has a lot of articles that are refused, and that's a real bitch for him, because he doesn't get paid when his articles are rejected. And yet he very clearly isn't bowing to, he isn't writing what he thinks will get published, even though he and his family are, on the, they're borderline, they're borderline impoverished for almost the entire time he's writing. They're extremely impoverished, and they're as he would put it, the wolf is at the door. He can barely pay his bills. He can barely feed his family. A number of his children die, probably due to those straitened circumstances. And nevertheless, I would argue that he continues to write for in a radical way, in a way that's Marxist. These materials can't be dismissed as just like trying to get the bills paid. And what I try to show is that the concerns of these famous writings about France in the Revolution of 1848 persist straight down through 11 years of journalism, which amounts to about 7 of the 49 substantive volumes of the Marx Engels complete works. And a very large, a very substantial proportion of his published output. And I point out in my editorial introductions that he wanted to include this material when he conceived of writing or publishing his complete works or collecting his works. He did not neglect it, and every time he, in a sense, provided a kind of bibliography of his writings, or an author's bibliography. He kind of, an author's biography. He discussed this, and he was proud of his work on the New York, for the New York Tribune. In all of it, he is arguing that there is a significant world historic transformation that has taken place in the world in the wake of the failed socialist revolution. There's a lot in your question that I didn't get to, but hopefully that's a kind of beginning to why I put these works together in the way that I did. So what I do to get to the substance of your question is I show that for Marx, there isn't like an American question or an Indian question, right? What there is a question of the growing consolidation of the world state, and in relation to it, the reorganization, the persistence and reorganization of proletarian revolution. So for Marx, the imperial state is not national. It is international, just as the bourgeois state before it was. And it is an international counter-revolution that's unfolding throughout the period that throughout the period of these writings, that begins to turn in the very late 1850s. And that turning is itself international. I just read, for instance, August Nimst on the American Revolution. And, apart from recognizing that there are people who Marx knew, there are like socialists from Europe, right? His analysis of the American Civil War is, did I say American Revolution? I meant the Civil War, the Second American Revolution. His analysis of the Civil War is in purely American terms, right? It's the slavery question, that just is some kind of original sin. It's a very typical American kind of blinkered perspective. And I'm not writing books here, I'm editing books here, but I do provide a good deal of editorial guidance and show, both through the editorial apparatus and in the material that I select, that for Marx, the same process that, for instance, is leading to the rebirth of the Revolution of 1848 in the form of Italian republicanism, is giving rise to the American Civil War. And while what's occasioning the Civil War is the counter-revolution, that counter-revolution is itself conditioned by European developments, is an expression of European developments. The Confederacy is what Louis Bonaparte and his British counterpart, Lord Palmerston, it's what they look like in the New World. And it is a project that could never have been conceived without European support. It was a project that was undertaken in concert with European military initiatives. And it was a project whose only possible success depended upon European involvement. In a fundamental way, the U.S. Civil War was its greatest victory, or the precondition of its victory is that it keeps the Europeans out, right? Which then results in us thinking the Europeans had nothing to do with it. But it was, in fact, a great Union victory that the Europeans were intimidated to stay out of the war. And they were intimidated to stay out of the war, yes, by the Union, for sure. Secretary of State Seward's threats to the European diplomats were very explicit. He said, "I'll wrap this world in flames," right, if you attempt to intervene. But the working classes of Europe also were, organized themselves and very self-awarely rekindled the spirit of 1848 in response to their government's attempts to intervene in the U.S. Civil War. So that's an example of how just saying Marx and Engels on the U.S. Civil War, like, misses everything, right? Because what you're just acting like, America is like this parallel and independent history. It has its own road to socialism. So, I just dismiss it, in a way that I think is pretty straightforward, that, it depends on a kind of very degraded Stalinist notion of national roads to socialism. I could talk about this with the other most famous body of this journalism would have been the writings on India. And I could talk about that too, that basically Marx is being dragged into, to take Marx on India, and to put it that way was basically to set up a question of Marx's relation. Did Marx favor or oppose imperialism? Which really is not the question at all for Karl Marx in the 1850s. Why is it not the question? Because it's not the question in the world. It's not the question of, there is and I talk about it and I supply the writings. There is something called the Indian Revolt of 1857-58. But this isn't really anti-imperialist in any meaningful sense. It's a dying gasp of an Indian aristocracy that's being displaced. The new and most vital forces within Indian society that are going to give rise to the future of India are resolutely opposed to the Indian Revolt. The urban forces of Indian society, which doesn't mean that they're on the that they're in favor of imperialism, but if you look at the dynamics of that revolt, it doesn't have the basis for reorganizing the Indian state, really. And so, Marx is all for, the success of the Indian Revolt. He's in favor of the military defeat of the English East India Company. But there's really no sense in which anybody who could speak the language of modern politics in India or in Europe, would have been like speaking for the revolt. They could have said whatever they wanted to say, but they would have had no organizational relationship to that revolt, whose own vocabulary and organizational forms were really, as I say, not recognizable in modern political terms. And so for Marx, writing on India is really writing about the Bonapartist state within Britain and the way that the form that it takes, given the fact that Britain has a massive overseas empire, and it has a truly massive overseas empire in the time that he's writing, in a way that, like, there's no rival to it, right? There's nothing comparable to it. And in India, of course, crystallizes that. The emergence of, like, European imperialism, with France having an empire and the Dutch having an empire and even the United States having an empire to a degree, really lies in the future. This is in the very heart of if you will, the global Pax Britannica, where the British Navy rules the world at the level of, like, overseas dominion and trade, and India is the, of course, anchor for that in Asia. So he talks about India in the context of influence in Persia, projecting influence into Persia. He talks about India in the context of going back in the Crimean War and the rivalry with Russia he talks about India in the context of projecting power into China in the Second Opium War. And in that context, the French are being basically brought in as junior partners. Palmerston and Louis Bonaparte are operating in concert just as they will with respect to America. So, these are just, the way in which these books were, so ultimately what happened with Marx and Engels on India, leftists in the 20th century read Marx and Engels on India and they realized this isn't anti-imperialism, and they decided, well, Marx is a pro-imperialist, since the only way, the only framework that the very publication suggests, I would argue, the very publication of a book of Marx and Engels on India really suggests the question, what do Marx and Engels have to say about the national destiny of India? Right? Which is just not their preoccupation. Their preoccupation is world socialism, which, of course, would include the territories of South Asia, but isn't about, one way or the other, national self-determination in the 19th century. That's just not the issue.
Right. I always think about the fact that, like, the national question in Marx and Engels is never, from what I can tell, generally expressed as like a principled, consistent stance on the national question, and more like what's going to value socialists in this or that specific instance. And
right,
it seems to me to be a kind of, at least post 1930s and maybe even post 1950s conception, to go back and reread this in the light of that and interpret it in the light of that. And one of the things I liked about your introductions to this is it made it pretty clear that trying to do that, like, say, maybe Kevin Anderson or Perry Anderson, either one of the Andersons actually in this case, will, because they're trying to answer a question just is not at play, like, for example, Marxist Eurocentrism, leads you into all kinds of cul-de-sacs that just, you're over interpreting something, right? Like,
this stuff is just, it's just anti-Marxism is all that it is, right? I mean, it comes out of anti-Marxism, and it just should be recognized for that, right? But yes, to your point, Derek, and as always, I appreciate how closely you read. In here, so what is the national self-determination that Marx is dealing with, right? He's dealing with the national self-determination movements of 1848, and he was directly involved in them, right? He was a German revolutionary, and after all, the German Revolution attempted to unify Germany, and there were national unification movements in Italy and Hungary. In fact, at the time, those were like the things that everybody knew about, right? In Britain or in America, if you asked your average person on the street, like, who were the famous revolutionaries, they would have mentioned Kossuth of Hungary and Mazzini of Italy. They probably had heard of the prominent French and German revolutionaries as well, but Mazzini and Kossuth were international celebrities. Marx is talking about, even with respect to those movements which were clearly developed and expressed in 1848. I open the book by talking about how he thinks that Kossuth has completely gone over to Bonaparte, and that Hungarian independence has just become a Bonapartist project. And of course, I think there's an echo. Marx and Engels will say the testament testamentary executors of the Revolution of 1848 are Louis Bonaparte and later Bismarck. And Bismarck himself will say, that the tasks of 1848, it turns out, aren't to be settled by, pamphlets and debate, but by blood and iron. Right. And they are recognizing that the organization of Europe is going to be undertaken by the major imperial powers, by the major capitalist states. And of course, German unification is undertaken by the capitalist state. And really, the whole question of national self-determination is not obviously revolutionary. The thing that Marx really despises is all the little petty nationalisms in the Balkans, which he sees as just projects of the Tsarist's cabinet in St. Petersburg, that these things are just being cooked up. So he sees national self-determination as becoming kind of, astroturf projects, if you will, which isn't to say that he's opposed to them. He gets into the greatest detail about them, their, if you will, revolutionary potential, in talking about Italian unification, where there really is a struggle between a kind of monarchical Bonapartist project, Victor Emmanuel, who was aligned with Louis Bonaparte, and a project of Mazzini and Garibaldi, which seems to carry with it a kind of, if naive, nevertheless Republican spirit rooted in 1848. Marx follows that very closely. And of course, the national self-determination project that he despises most is that of the Confederacy.
Which people do not like to consider a national determination project because it kind of messes up some of their conceptions that it's always good.
Right. Well, so exactly how, but those are exactly the terms in which it was sold to liberals in both Britain and France,
and is actually probably still a large part of its historiography today, and that by means saying that it was never a national liberation project. It was about slavery, and in which case, yeah, it's about slavery and the national and state sovereignty to impose it, which is is kind of a national.
I mean, to say framework. That it's about slavery is just to, the problem is that people don't understand what they're saying when they say that. For Marx, what it's about is it's about the entire destiny of the new world, right? If you're talking about slavery, like for him, the Confederacy necessarily, that the success of the Confederacy will necessarily dictate the overthrow of the American Revolution. That whatever you mean by the North, it won't be the legatee of 1776, right? Probably it'll be overthrown, right? Probably Lincoln is just right that a house divided a house divided against itself cannot stand. It must be either wholly one thing or the other, entirely slave or entirely slave or entirely free. And that's what Marx thinks will happen, and he goes into some of this in great detail in some of the articles that I include, where he's kind of explaining, some of the journalism that I publish is not from the Tribune. It's from other publications, and one of them is called De Pressa, and it's published in Central Europe, and it's in there you see Marx like explaining, like, Marx, the cosmopolitan Londoner, and he's like, yeah, I know these people, I've been there, I've been to Central Europe. I know these people don't know anything. And he kind of explains America to them, including the geography of the place. And he says, look, there's no way that that the Midwest, that the entire Ohio, Tennessee, Ohio river basins are going to be in one country, and the Mississippi into which those rivers drain, and therefore all transportation of agricultural goods will be in another country. That's just not going to happen. So what are you talking about? You're talking about the South will necessarily take over Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, etc. And if you say that, what you're saying is that really even New England is going to fall, because that's going to be completely unviable. And so for him, it's a question of, of slavery, in the sense that the whole of even the freedom that resulted from 1776, right? The kind of beachhead of freedom in the New World that flowed out of the initial revolution, namely the Free North, will be rolled back, right? And it will also mean the reintroduction. It'll mean the collapse of the Monroe Doctrine and the reintroduction of European colonialism, right? So the exact nature of the alliance between the Confederacy and the regimes in Europe, Louis Bonaparte and Palmerston, those discussions don't advance beyond a certain point. But it's very clear, and of course the French overthrow the government of Mexico in the course of the war and install the Emperor Maximilian. So it's very clear in the Spanish or recapturing territory in the Caribbean. They're sort of minor bit players. The Confederacy has anticipated this. I don't know if your listeners know this. I'm sure you do, Derek. But the Confederacy was already the forces that give rise to the Confederacy were already trying to overthrow governments in Honduras and in Cuba, etc. They're called filibusters, right? Where you would have these like mercenaries who would take troops, out of veterans from the Mexican-American War, and there's a movie made about the most famous episode, a guy named Walker in Honduras, that's just called Walker. That's a pretty good movie, and so all of those impulses that were tied to the expansionism of slavery and a kind of imperialist impulse emanating from Europe are all being defeated on the battlefields in North America. And Marx is super clear about that.
Right. I mean, he basically, and I think correctly, realizes like the Southern planter class is an aristocratic class, and like there's and that it would be highly regressive for them to win, like by any standard, It's not. I mean, but that's interesting to me in so much that gets.
I quote. I'm just going to say this because I have to get to dig in, Derek. I quote. There's a. Do you have the? If you watch The Untold History of the United States by Oliver Stone?
Oh God, no.
Well, there's the bonus disc has a conversation between Oliver Stone and Tariq Ali, and in it, Tariq Ali says, it probably would have been better if the North had lost the Civil War.
What? Okay.
Because then we wouldn't have been saddled with American imperialism. It's pretty nuts, right? I mean, the left is all over the place, and even, you'll hear this a lot. I mean, Claude McKay and who am I thinking of? John Reed in their reports to I think it's the second Congress of the Comintern. they describe the Civil War as just a matter of Northern industrial capital's aggression. I mean, it's understandable why they would say that, but it's rotten. Ultimately, it is rotten, and it fails to grasp, what I emphasize in the book, which is that solidarity with the Union is the reason. It's not the Polish uprising of 1863. Solidarity with the Union is the galvanizing reason for the formation of the First International. Full stop. The First International has to be viewed in the context of the unfolding of the American Civil War as an international revolution. And of course, there are many implications to that. The struggle, the working classes, contest with Parliament over the Second Great Reform Bill, including the Great Hyde Park demonstration of 1866, the so-called Glorious Revolution in Spain, ultimately the Commune itself. I mean, a lot of the initial agitation against Louis Bonaparte's regime is about discontent with the regime's stifling of the expressions of French support for the Union. There's a wonderful book called The Cause of All Nations, written by a academic historian named Dan Doyle, where he really gets into details about the agitation amongst the French for at one point, where they just won't have it, like the students of France just will not have it anymore, is when Lincoln dies, and Louis Bonaparte tries to he brings out his military into the streets, and the students basically riot through the streets of Paris until they can fight their way through to the house of the American ambassador, because they demand the right to present their condolences to the American people on the death of Lincoln. Right. So Lincoln and the Union cause is really a expression of a anti-Bonapartist unfolding revolution, right? Or, if you will, and better, a counter-Bonapartist revolution, right? Which is really the way that we should begin to think about what socialism would be. That's a kind of critical Bonapartism. Because Bonapartism is the negative image of the dictatorship of the proletariat, just to sort of lodge that thought, right?
So one of the parts of your second book that I was kind of most interested in and kind of found the most complicated was Marx and Engels' writing on the Taiping and in China, because that doesn't fit the quote pro-imperialist model or the anti-imperialist model at all.
Right.
And his stance is kind of complicated, but would you like to go into what Marx and Engels actually said about the Taiping Rebellion and development in China?
I mean, the Taiping Rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, of course, is one of these very murky events. The character of which is, and I don't know the vicissitudes of it. I'd be interested to know the vicissitudes of CCP historiography on it. I don't know if you know much about it.
It's contested, actually, and I don't know so much know their current status on it, but I do know they went back and forth on whether or not it was a model, and some of the early pre-Mao figures even took names from the Taiping Rebellion, but that's dropped later on. It's kind of a mess.
Right. So it's a crisis in the state for sure, and the state loses control of vast swaths of southern China, and a kind of parallel state is erected from Nanjing, and the upheaval that it involves, and the and basically the disruption to society that it involves in terms of transportation networks and the like, results in massive amounts of death, like staggering amounts of death. That
something like 7 to 8 times the people who died in the American Civil War died in that rebellion.
Yeah, and so for Marx and Engels, they for them, they're looking for signs of the they will they will look at even the defeat, and I think Engels just says it, like, and I quote it, like in the case of the Anglo-Persian War. They see that that what's happening in Asia is that there's this deep churning of Asian society, right? And it gets laid out, I think, in most detail, because after all, there is the most detail with respect to India in the 1850s. So there are two bodies of writings on India. There's writings on the Anglo-Persian War of 1856-7, and there's writing on the Taiping Rebellion, and there's writings on the Second Opium War in these volumes. And so if I could just kind of take a broad view of some of that before I get into the details about China, they see the effects of capitalism there, and that's already anticipated in the Communist Manifesto, right, where Marx describes British imports into China as like a heavy artillery, right, that's breaking down all Chinese walls, right? That language in the manifesto, that the inundation of imports from the Industrial Revolution in Europe, in that sense, a vast disruption and to a large degree reversal of world historic trade patterns of like Europe selling textiles to Asia, right? It is a world historic reversal. Silks and cottons had been purchased from Asia for millennia, going back to the Roman Empire, and so these things are kind of dissolving or disintegrating. They're acting as a kind of solvent to dissolve the pre-existing social relations in Asia, whatever you want to call those. If you want to call them feudal or some kind of patrimonial, or whatever you want to call them, they're being dissolved. And Marx describes it with respect to India. He says, the melancholy of the Hindu is that an old world is being destroyed and no new world is being put in its place, right? So this is a similar problem that you see, even in Germany, right? That the old world is being destroyed in Europe, but the bourgeois revolution, in the form of like republicanism and liberal rights and the subordination of the state to society, basically the bourgeois revolutions that had been experienced in America, Britain, the Netherlands, Britain, America, France, isn't extending into Germany. It isn't extending into Italy, right? Bourgeois relations aren't expanding. There isn't an integration of the world into this, mutually beneficial, cooperative, global humanity that the Enlightenment envisioned, that say Adam Smith envisioned. Instead, there's some kind of disintegration and upheaval that is extremely destructive, that's gripping Asian society. And those are the terms that Marx and Engels see the Taiping Rebellion in, right? They see it as a very directionless, kind of groping, lurching churning of society. And Engels, for instance, will talk about the salutary effects of defeat, right? That maybe the Persians being defeated in war will help to kind of crystallize a political response to the European challenge, or that the defeat of the Indian revolt will help to crystallize a politics in India, or that the just simply the process, which is largely an internal Chinese process of the Taiping Rebellion, will result not in something that was planned or intended, but nevertheless in a kind of Hegelian behind the backs of actors way, will open a road for greater political, more fruitful political developments in Asia. Essentially for the emergence of something like modern politics. And of course, that is happening. Mm-hmm. With respect to the Arrow War or the Second Opium War, I lay a lot of emphasis on that mm-hmm. in the second volume that you're referring to, Derek, because it is a moment where Marx sees his real focus is on the politics in the UK. And what he sees is a consolidation of a kind of, what I call parliamentary Bonapartism. Marx's analysis is that the pluralistic party competitive system in the UK, that of course is centered around Parliament, does not preclude the erection of a Bonapartist state there. And we've talked about this before in terms of like the role of the expansion of the bureaucracy, the development of metropolitan police forces, the growing independence of the bureaucracy, including the diplomatic corps, and then this highly recalcitrant to, if you will, democratic pressure military, which is overseas in the case of the UK. And it's a theme that he really adumbrates with respect to the Crimean War, which is that the policy towards Russia doesn't change no matter who's in power, mm-hmm. right? And that even the Whigs are completely in bed with the Tsar, right? And it takes a massive assertion of British civil society to even launch the Crimean War. It's against every impulse of the cabinet, right? And that would be the kind of the formal political expression of this parliamentary Bonapartism, is the growing independence of the cabinet from Parliament, from parliamentary pressures, right? And the continuities that you see in cabinet government, despite pluralistic, despite the circulation of elites in those offices, that is mediated through party politics.
As a contemporary side note, I'd just like to note that this is popular among, this is popularly defended amongst quote progressives today, is the consistency and independence of the administrative state apparatus. It seems interesting to me that
it defended us from Trump, right? It's anti-fascist.
I find that argument.
People might be pro-Putin, but thankfully the state is on the side of Ukrainian democracy and all the rest, right? Yeah. What were you going to say? Sorry, don't let me.
No. It's that's one of the things where, when you actually read Marxist journalism, you immediately realize that our conceptions of state and what parts of the state may even be useful are fundamentally different than what they did, because the idea of like these independent cabinet positions that are consistent and that have no check by the popular will, that Marx opposed that explicitly, is like almost off the table for discussion. I mean, admittedly, progressives don't claim to be Marxist, but a lot of Marxists, you know, are in line with progressives and yet totally ignore this element of Marxist thought.
Well, they ignore this element of Marxism. I mean, let's just be plain, right? They ignore the whole fucking history of Marxism, because, you know, this is what the revisionist dispute is about, right? Like, like Millerand taking a cabinet position in France was a, you know, was directly at, you know, at issue in the Second International. It was really the international dimension of the second of the revisionist dispute, and was discussed by both Kautsky and Rosa Luxemburg, and indeed in all the international sort of corollaries or analogs of the more famous debates in Germany, of course, in France itself. So, you know, it may not have risen to a certain level of clarity in Britain, because Britain didn't exactly have socialism. I mean, you know, but in America and France and Germany, in places that really did, you know, that had socialist parties, it was understood that you don't take executive positions, and that a cabinet position is an executive position, right? Like, that's the difference. Is, you know, you can be a member of Parliament, you can be a member of the House of Commons in this, you know, as it were, but you know, to accept a cabinet position is to administer capitalism. And yeah, so Marx is pretty clear about all that, and you know, from the beginning, and he, you know, but the lying, the deceit, the manifest manipulation of the press, which is a big subtext of these books that I could, you know, which you really just have to read, I think, to get the full subtlety of Marx's treatment of the press and its, you know, what it means for this, for the press to come to express state interests. But very apropos to our time. All of it is leading up to a parliamentary showdown over, you know, basically what happened is that Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who's a product of the, you know, he's a foreign minister almost his whole life. Mm-hmm. He is the impresario of British foreign policy, going all the way, you know, he basically does his understudy work, you know, in 1815, you know, in the negotiations around Vienna. He is a pure product of, and an architect, a major architect of the European counter-revolutionary peace that emerges out of the Napoleonic Wars, and embodies the kind of the contradictions of the British role in that peace, in that, you know, obviously Britain is more liberal than its allies, you know, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, you know, the other architects of that peace. And so he can appear more liberal in relation to them, but is really their master, and the master of a conservative state order. And he is, in a sense, conditioned to the secrecy of the Foreign Department in taking it up after 1848 as prime minister. He's elevated to prime minister, and brings all of the kind of bureaucratic and secret impulses of his entire career to bear in undertaking a foreign policy without reference to to Parliament, including making peace and war without reference to Parliament. And this really becomes an issue. And the East India Company is important to that because he can use the East India Company to make war in Asia and claim that it's sort of the Indian government's deal. It's the company's doing it, right? Because it's a separate army, it's a separate military structure, and has its own finances. So he can get around parliamentary power, the parliamentary power to declare war and to fund war in Asia in particular by using the East India Company. That's part of the issue of what the East India Company becomes after it ceases to be a trading enterprise. Why does it still exist, right? This is one of its great benefits from the point of view of the ruling class, certainly from Palmerston's point of view. And he has directed, he has directed the consul in China, in Canton, to spark a war. And of course, it can't be proved, right? Because there's a lot of secrecy involved. But basically, it becomes very clear that a war is being sparked in China with, that is a kind, through false flags and all sorts of skullduggery to gin up a war. And he loses a lot of support from liberals who generally support him, including Gladstone's sort of one attempt to oppose him. Eventually, Gladstone will form the Liberal Party with Palmerston. But in the crisis around the Chinese War, all the ironies, in a sense, are coming out because the old Tory gentry are like speaking for peace and commerce, and the consul in China that Palmerston's operating through is the editor of Jeremy Bentham's papers, right? So he's like a true-born heir to radical English liberalism, right? And Marx is just delighting in the ironies of it, but he's also showing the full-blown political crisis that's emerging around this war. And it's and basically Palmerston dissolves Parliament. They censure him, not censor, censure him for essentially evading parliamentary scrutiny, refusing to provide documents to Parliament, refusing to answer parliamentary questions, stuff that we're just completely used to now, right? That the government cannot be, the government bureaucrats won't answer questions. In this case, their chief is helping to shield them. And in the election, the liberals say, Cobden and Bright, the famous liberals of the day in Parliament, they say explicitly, we've got a Bonaparte here, except he's a lot stronger than Louis Bonaparte because our democracy is a lot more deeply rooted than the democracy that he's, that the plebiscites in France, without parties can claim. And so he's going to, he's more powerful and more dangerous. John Bright gives a speech to this effect in the Free Trade Hall in Manchester. So it really is the last gasp of liberalism, even as it's showing the full contradictions of liberalism, right? Because this guy John Bowring, who's the consul in China, he was friends with all of these people, Cobden and Bright. He was a card-carrying member of their circles. And in the election, basically, that is, when so Palmerston is censured, and he just says, "Fuck you! I'm dissolving Parliament." He dissolves Parliament. He goes to the people for an election, and he wins re-election. And this, for Marx, is the point where you have something that's truly parallel to the events in France, where you have the people voting democratically against liberalism, right? Unmistakably, right? That they are voting for that the democratic basis of Bonapartism is clearly expressed around what, of course, in this case was a jingoistic appeal to British patriotism in the face of, you know, the insults given it by the Chinese. You know, I'm not going to go into the details of the incidents that provoked these hostilities in Canton, but basically the claim was our flag was insulted by the Chinese. And like I said, the whole thing was cooked up to create those hostilities. I think it's pretty factual, you know, historically sound to say that. And that's what Marx assumes. You know, Marx is like, and of course the liberal press is saying it at the time. And so the issue for, you know, around the Second Opium War is, for Marx, you know, he goes into the greatest detail about how this is playing out domestically and how, you know, for Britain, right, in anywhere, Bonapartism is a domestic issue, right? Imperialism is a domestic issue for Marxists. Like most fundamentally, right? What is imperialism? It's not America in Iraq or in Syria or Ukraine. It's the fact that there are tens of thousands of police who have New York City under armed occupation and Chicago under armed occupation. And that's necessary, right? I'm not saying that the police should be gotten rid of under capitalism, but the necessity of that force, of those bodies of armed men, is the heart of imperialism. It's why Norway is an imperialist state. Denmark is an imperialist state. A capitalist state is an imperialist state. That's all that Marx means by it. But in the British context, where it has these territories all over the place, right, of course that's significant for the domestic politics. And it's a training ground for those bodies of armed men. It's where bodies of armed men go to learn their craft of controlling the population, et cetera. It's very nice to have India and all of these places for the ruling class to go and get paid, of course, lots of money to learn how to non-democratically lord it over the people. And those are habits that they can bring home very conveniently. And so Palmerston's rule, of course, looks very different than Louis Bonaparte's, but it's really because Louis Bonaparte is ultimately a local expression of a world state that is ultimately, of course, headquartered in Britain, right? And that's Marx's analysis in this era, right? And even when the world state is at war with itself, that's an expression of its cohesion, right? So that my third volume is, I'm still working on it, which will be about the Crimean War, where Marx is basically arguing that the way that the British and the French express their alliance with the Tsar is by going to war with him. Because the war strengthens the state internationally. And it never is addressing anything fundamental. You know, it's never threatening any, as it were, party to the war. It's a fake war, as Marx puts it.
Oh, well, I guess the last question, which may be a doozy in and of itself, is how do you think all this got so obscured?
It's a really good question. You know, I've been in, you know, of course, you know, I'm a member of Platypus, and I've been reading, you know, we've been running a reading group this summer on politics. And, you know, I think it really gets to the obscuration of the question of democracy. that it's really unclear, I think, to the left how its project is anything other than democratic or anything more than democratic. I mean, the left is obviously in favor of democracy, and yet democracy is the adequate basis for capitalism, right? It's the most adequate basis for the Bonapartist state, and it's this problem of democracy, this question of it. It's not a battle for democracy; it's a battle of democracy, as Marx puts it in the manifesto. And of course, that problem gets deepened as a result of the lesson. The lesson of 1848 is just how deep that problem runs, given that the counter-revolution takes the form of universal suffrage democracy in France. And so I think that when we're talking about the trajectory of Marxism, right, it's really the critical current within socialism that brings those lessons of 1848 to bear, that says, look, we have to capture state power and institute we can't institute socialism. We have to institute a dictatorship of the proletariat. Why? To begin to address the basis of democracy, right? The basis of democracy is capitalism, right? The reason why we have democracy is capitalism. Democracy isn't just a kind of an undifferentiated or timeless or ahistoric political form. It's a form of politics that's conditioned by the proletarianization of society. So like very basically, when people don't have any guaranteed place in society, right? When we're all replaceable, we're all fungible, we can all be dismissed, and increasingly, and that creates all sorts of pressures that we internalize. We don't even think about, right? Like pressures to conform, pressures to not speak out of turn, right? Pressures not to call attention to ourselves, right? All of the ways in which capitalism as a society that's not just got cracks in it, but is riven by contradiction. That our, in a sense, last claim that we can fall back on is as citizens, that we can vote, right? And of course, capitalism, in a sense, the primal image that people should have of capitalism isn't of bankers or Wall Street or really even factory production, but of the isolated individual presented with prefabricated choices in a voting booth, right? That is the essence of capitalism, right? The atomized individual who is can side with and can, in a sense, liquidate himself into a collectivity that can serve as the basis for the perpetuation of capitalist society politically. So the dictatorship of the proletariat is intended to, of course, take state power. To what does that mean? It means to historically what it means. Who knows what it means today, or if it means anything at all today? But what it meant historically is that the working class would supply the staff of the state, right? That to the extent that the state had to persist, to the extent that it did persist, it would do so because of the ongoing contradictions of a society founded in bourgeois right or bourgeois social relations, that there would still need to be there would be questions adjudicated by force, but that adjudication of questions by force would be undertaken by the class that is, as it were, at the most closely experiencing the contradictions that are giving rise to the necessity of force. So you might have to break a strike, right? But you would have, but the working class would have to break that strike, right? In the name of society as a whole, let's say, under the dictatorship of the proletariat. So there's a question of socialist politics operating in civil society, and like we were talking about before, not seeking to administer capitalism, but only as it were to administer capitalism on the terms in which it can begin to implement its program, right? And what we mean by taking state power. An essential aspect of that program would be at least the commencing of the withering away of the state, which would commence with the restaffing of the state. And so I think that whole horizon has been lost, and I think that that in that sense the anarchist core of our aspiration to socialism has been completely lost, right? That what we seek is a world not in which the people rule, but in which no one rules, right? That socialism is about the self-regulation of a society of freely associated people, whose decision-making processes would take lots of forms. I don't want to have a voice in how some pandemic gets dealt with. I just don't want the people who are making those decisions to be subject to the pressures that they're subject to under capitalism. Right? I'd be very happy with certain kinds of rules of experts and certain, and the professional associations. I want the doctors to figure out what the protocols are for when you stop trying to revive a patient. Right? I'm just concerned that that doctors and professional associations are under all sorts of pressures and distorted out of all recognition in this society, right? And I also want to be liberated. In other words, another way of putting it is that the left too often acts like socialism is going to be like one long DSA meeting or something, and that we're all going to wake up and vote on 100 plebiscites every morning, right? We want to be liberated from politics. As much as we want to realize the potential of democracy, we also want to be able to live in society. And I think that those aspirations in socialism are gone. What it would, in other words, what's the alternative to democracy? What does it mean to have a critique of democracy? What is the self-regulation of society, or what I'm calling anarchism, which is really a liberal impulse, right? That's coming out of the Enlightenment. The whole Enlightenment is anarchist in an important way that people just do not understand, right? And the kind of return of the state in conjunction with democracy, that whole problem is obscured. Like, why is it obscured? Like, why did socialism, like the whole imagination of socialism, collapse? It's a long story, but it has to do with, I think it became, I think people became overwhelmed by the task. I think that revolutions seem to promise war. The self-mastery of the task of socialism, of like working through political parties that then manifest the contradictions of capitalism within themselves, and that contradiction has to be prosecuted politically, and the splits and regroupments that are involved, the dialectical, or in the Marxist sense, the negative dialectical prosecution of democratic politics through socialist party forms. It became unmanageable. You can call that Stalinism. You can call that, retreat. It's a very deep question that I don't, I'm hesitant to say just Stalinism and to kind of rehearse a certain, Trotskyist narrative. That is the narrative that ultimately I'm trained through, that I think through. But I'm not, I don't know what you think, but I'm not sure that means anything to young people now. Like if you try to tell them about, like, the zigzagging character of Stalinism, and, Stalinism is like the gracing of the accomplished fact, and like the history is so obscure to them. What I would say is that, the struggle for socialism is a great big gamble, right? It risks, a lot of upheaval. It did result in like massive upheaval and war. And I think that overall experience in the first half of the 20th century generated a massive recoil and retreat. And a kind of, I don't know, see no evil, hear no evil kind of, self stupefaction. And now we're left with, like, I don't know what, like the very impulse to politics itself, I think people are terrified by. I don't know what you think, but it's something along those lines, right? That there's a real forgetting that's kind of so that you're a teacher, right? Right? One of the things I would say is that, just to come back around one last time, if I could, to Marxist journalism, one of the things that impresses you so much, impressed me so much, is the level at which it's written. Right? This was stuff that was written, the English language stuff for the New York Tribune was written for the largest circulating newspaper in the world. This stuff, Abraham Lincoln would have read this stuff out in Illinois. It was put together in like a weekly edition that was sent around the country, and that's why it was the biggest circulating paper in the world. And you just can't imagine, because Marx writes, he's just quoting Latin and Greek and Italian and whatever, right, left and right, and just his language and his thoughts are on a very high level. And rates of literacy were much lower, right? The people who read this material, they were not like all super literate, and undoubtedly in the 19th century, literate people read it out loud to illiterate people. and in like a profound way, like the illiterates of the 19th century are more literate than like professors I know today. Right. And like, how do you, like, you know, like the world itself, right, in the age of the rise of socialism, educated people, right, the way that they the way they organized their own lives was to be able to confront their own circumstances with sober senses, as Marx puts it. Right, that was something that like people did, like, you know, in their church life,
Mm-hmm.
in their civil associational life, on the whole. And you know, we're living in a time where you know, there are so many tasks, and it requires a division of labor that I would, you know, I just can do my part, you know, in trying to educate people at a high level, you know, a small group of people at a what I hope is a sophisticated level, and produce some books that maybe a couple hundred people will read, you know, and maybe some future generation might pick up. You know, it's a daunting question, you know, that gets down into like psychology and everything else.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a daunting question. And as I've confronted with my brief foray into socialism, which is now 20 something years.
It ain't that brief. As I'm sure you're beginning to realize, these are the best years of your life.
Yeah. What I've seen is an increasing feeling like we're on repetition compulsion with the enormity of the task, and that each round is more degenerated in how it's presenting itself than the last. And that's like this revival of certain things we saw in the 80s is weaker than it was in the 80s, which was itself weaker than it was in the 60s, which was itself weaker than it was in the 30s. And
but when you reflect upon your position within that, Derek, or others, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I also, you know, I wonder, because I feel like, you know, you, and to a degree I and others, we're sort of the ones writing the history.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I feel like they're not really telling their own history. You know what I mean?
Oh, no, they're not. I mean, they're avoiding their own history. I've been reading recently, like, books get thrown out on the quote left to the left of the DSA or whatever, of like what's coming out of like something like Midwestern Marx, and it's an erasure even of like Marxist Leninist history, to use their terminology. Like talking about the left in the 1970s without mentioning once, not a single time, the Sino-Soviet split. How do you even talk about that without mentioning that? And you kind of realize that.
Oh, you mean they want to be Maoists and believe that Chairman Mao was the scourge of the bourgeoisie,
right?
And just completely obscure the fact that he was the one who shook Nixon's hand, and
I mean,
of the Soviet bloc, or the
right
bloc.
And there was proxy wars where he sided with the U.S. Like, just all this stuff is just bracketed out, or the debates within China itself is bracketed out. It's and you'll hear stuff
bracketed out in India and in Bangladesh, even though it created a refugee crisis of tens of millions. Yeah, the Chinese support for the Pakistani military, of course, and the U.S. support, and Naxalism flourishes in those very regions, right, of Bengal, right? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. The ironies are abundant, and not just for those of you who think this is just a Western Marxist problem or just an American problem. I assure you, from my experience worldwide, it is not. Yeah.
I mean, do you think that people your age, do you think the millennials are beginning to write their own history?
No, I do not. No, not so far. I think they're afraid of their own history, frankly. Like, I think confronting.
There aren't even memoirs of like organizing for Sanders or like even from the major people.
Right. No,
never mind like Occupy kind of, like it's amazing, like the paucity of material that's, like it does, I think it does combine with this like seemingly intensified resolve to tick every box in the repetition compulsion.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're going to do every single thing that the New Left did. It's very distressing.
It is very distressing. I've been writing a book on Christopher Lasch for like 2 years, and every time I go back and read
I didn't know that.
Yeah. But every time I go back and read his late 60s, 70s material up into his early 80s material, I am struck by like how unbelievably similar it is, including stuff like the resting on your laurels after the fight against Nixon is over and turning into like this depoliticized, very self-focused, very therapeutic focused way of understanding self and politics. But it's also interesting because you have the critique of Fordism morphing into this, narcissistic person, but it's also the same people have to defend Fordism, right? I mean, Chris Catron talks about this too. And with us, there's almost like a, neoliberalism, as I understand it, has probably been dying since probably about 2010, maybe. I don't know. And what is going to turn into is unclear to me. It seems to be unclear to a lot of people, but there is a way in which, even though the left can't, frankly, shut up about neoliberalism and call things neoliberal that even aren't, it also is defending it because it refuses to like deal with the fact that it is its primary. It is wedded to the party that, even more than Reagan in the 1990s up and through Obama, solidified that regime. I mean, and in the fact that, there are so many Marxists who were even critical of the Obama administration, who then celebrated the Biden administration. I think of Dylan Ryby and Robert Blinner's like 7 theses that yes, there was some mild criticism of Biden in there, but it's been even the resistance that was minor to that form of the Democratic Party has been liquidated. And
it really does feel like post neoliberalism in the sense that it doesn't take on any distinctive shape of its own, or it doesn't feel like a project even of the right has been crystallized in any way. Trump certainly wasn't allowed to, or couldn't, failed to in any way chart a course forward.
Mm-hmm.
You would have thought that he represented that kind of post neoliberal project in the absence of the left, but it really hasn't amounted to much. And yeah, the only thing that the left and seemingly, capitalism, the most CEOs can imagine is some kind of endless, project of the civil rights movement, or like whatever they imagine the 60s to be, right? Some sort of project of like, perpetuating the new social movements that came out of it. And, under the explicit patronage of the Democratic Party. Yeah, that's the thing that's really changed, I guess, is that the Democrats are sort of unmistakably the vehicle of it in a way that no new leftist would have thought of, right? That they would have seen the distance between, because obviously they would have seen the distance. Their foundational experience was hostility to the Democratic Party in the civil rights movement, and they knew that the Democrats were, kicking and screaming as the governing party of this country, kicking out their own Dixiecrat leg, and
which they didn't completely do until like 2000. Honestly, like I like to like. It's one of the things, even as like one of these elder millennial, younger Gen Xer people that I'm in that gap cohort, I remember when the South was run by Democrats in my lifetime. Like Zell Miller is like one of the primary governors of Georgia. I remember. And
the whole idea, I mean, obviously it's a really foundational myth that the Republicans became the racist party. Right? Like, if you don't have that, the whole house of cards falls apart, Derek. I mean, if you can't fucking convince yourself that, the white supremacists are organizing through the Republican Party, and it all, yes, the Democrats used to be the white supremacists, but now the Republicans are, and I always knew that was a lie. Politicians had support, and when they got kicked out of the Democrats, some of them joined the Republican Party. After a great deal of reluctance, but it hasn't really reproduced itself. And yeah, I had 2 Democratic senators and a Democratic governor growing up in the state of Tennessee. And I remember Sam Nunn and, like Democrats like Charlie Wilson, kind of, war hawk. Sam Nunn was also this way, I guess soft on the welfare state, but no more or less than most Republicans were. Certainly the Rockefeller Republicans were. It's like people have to convince themselves of quite a bit. And now, of course, they're getting black politicians in the Republican Party in the South, and they just scream Uncle Tom. It's just, I don't know. I mean, I find my Democratic friends to be more openly, I don't know, more insufferable in a sense that, like, I feel that they're dangerous, like the level of their delusions today. I don't like the lack of curiosity just about the, basic things. We've all experienced this, like the obvious symptoms, from imprisoning Julian Assange over Podesta's emails through the Twitter files. It's getting more and more crazy how much they're willing to throw out in the name of, the progressivism of Biden.
Well, it's interesting to me because it's interesting to me in the sense that it becomes very clear how little it means, in so much that, like, Biden's progressivism in most ways represents an administrative continuity with Trump, with the exception of it is not as disruptive to the administrative state itself, but almost every policy is the same, including the stuff that really supposedly mattered, such as the immigration regime and stuff like that. And at the same token, the states that have, conservative governors in the South have have gotten much more audacious in what they're willing to do, and yet like the fight against that has been totally dropped, or is just used as a wedge in the national debate, but it is not seen as anything that needs to be confronted at the
right
at the local level. And actually the other response we see is a return to the 80s 90s sort of like anemic inside the Democrat track of like, you know, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., whatever you think of him, does resemble in many ways Dennis Kucinich. And Cornel West is seemingly kind of like a parody of Ralph Nader. And that is a reversal to norm of the prior 2 decades. Like in so much that Sanders is like McGovern light. This is like the 2 decades after that light too, and it worries me also in so much that like even the kind of technocratic apparatus of the Democrats is clearly cracking in so much that they literally cannot imagine anyone running it other than an 84-year-old man or 80 whatever year old man. There's no backbench at all. And there's
nothing parallel to the accomplishments of neoliberalism in the offing. I mean,
right.
You know, neoliberalism obviously was, you know, I guess it's not obvious, but it's pretty obvious to me that it was, you know, the way that of a form of patriarchy was smashed and all, you know, what we could call racism in the division of labor was smashed. You know, also, you know, there was an immense accession of women and, of course, of racial minorities into the American labor force and into broader, you know, strata of the American labor force than ever before. And of course, that has international corollaries. And there was a expansion of wealth or prosperity, at least at the level of the elimination of extreme poverty on an international scale. You know, you can grant all these things to the neoliberals. You know, I know you're not supposed to, because neoliberalism is supposedly capitalism itself or something, or the harshest form of capital. It's not, right? It's just the form that it took. It's the form that the collapse of the New Left took. But the present just feels like it, you know, today is going to be the best day of all days to come. That nothing, you know, that nothing is better on the immediate horizon, and the Democrats don't really claim that it is. You know, however hollow, you know, It's Morning in America or whatever Reagan's bullshit was, you know, it was semi-convincing, and certainly Clinton's bullshit was semi-convincing. I mean, I was there. I was 21 years old in 1992, and there was a lot more opportunity for young people in 1992 than there seems to be today. And it doesn't seem like anybody wants to address that. Like the basic question of how you do, you know, like, I guess like people being able to get jobs and like, you know, minimal prosperity. I don't know. It seems to me like there isn't a political project that is mobilizing even the aspiration towards like bourgeois, you know, prosperity.
Yeah, much less anything else. But yes,
much less anything else, right? And obviously, there's like a hatred of the. In other words, the millennials have been moaning about what a miserable capitalism they've been living in their whole lives, and how it's so futureless, and how the Gen X and other preceding generations had it better off, and that, you know, their future was sold down the river. But you know, I feel like they never confronted their aspiration to capitalism even.
Right.
The lameness of their leftism is tied to the fact that they could never like squarely confront what they really, you know, what the middle class ambient phenomena on campus and generationally was a demand for a more prosperous capitalism, right? And at some level that was generative in the sense that, you know, for my generation, just people were conservative, right? Just a lot more conservative generation. You know, people that didn't bother with Marx and socialism. But the way that millennials dealt with Marxism and socialism seemed like it comes to seem now like such an abuse. And that's why I'm interested to talk to you, because I think of you as somebody who really like managed, and I know that you're older, you know, but you managed to experience your time in a way that gave you some real leverage on this history. That's why I keep asking, like, who's going to write their history? And, you know, like, who's going to confront the fact that, like, we read Marx and we read socialism, and it was like, it gripped a generation. And I don't think the Jacobin crowd's going to do it. You know, I don't think
they're going to fade off into that good night, because their political project has also kind of become an institution that even itself cannot generate. Like, when's the last time you've really heard about anything going on in the DSA, even within socialist circles within Twitter, you know, or something like that, where, you know, the discourse is, and I don't hear it anymore, really. It's kind of,
you know that so much better than I do, Derek. How would you trace that?
I would trace what's happened is it's been a return to the old norm, where the DSA is kind of a New York political machine, which is what it was in the 80s, and actually more successfully so than now. They got mayors back then. But now it does so by like taking dues from other parts of the country and basically routing them into the Democratic Party apparatus of New York and LA. And people, you know, they don't want to confront that. They don't want to say like, oh, I was in an organization that, even though it's national, basically has only had success in these two areas, and it has a national focus, and 80% of my dues go to that. They don't want to say that, because it would mean that the chimera of whatever left unity they thought was a chimera that was basically a center of the Democratic Party like control opposition project, which honestly some of the best organizers of our generation went into. And the other thing that they don't want to look at is for all the labor militancy and labor unrest that there is right now, the formal labor union movement has never been a smaller percentage of the U.S. workforce than it is after their supposed revival, and including in areas where we saw like real grassroots agitation, like say red state labor teachers unions and whatnot, where now people have just given, and this isn't spoken about really, but people have obviously just given up on that because they're just leaving the profession altogether, which, you know, and there's enough shitty employment out there that's not going to show up in massive unemployment numbers, because we also have a declining population. But it does mean that like a whole lot of people are even willing to just walk out on what was traditionally means of like getting out of the like blue collar working class into the quote professional managerial class, or whatever you want to call it, whatever new category you want to paste that with. What it has meant for me personally is to feel like I've seen people who have used radical rhetoric their entire lives and kind of walked away from it. And even stuff like the diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff, like the corporate version of this, that also is beginning to just not have the kind of pull that it used to, because it obviously doesn't change anything. The biggest loss of black wealth that we saw in this country was in 2007. No, not the biggest loss. Yeah, the biggest loss of black wealth was 2007, and it's never been recovered.
Why do you say 2007?
Because that's when
crisis.
That's the housing crisis. That was the loss of everybody's wealth, but it disproportionately affected the black community. Like that's.
So but 2007-8. I mean,
yeah,
a lot of 2008. Yeah.
Well, I mean, really, it's a period from 2007 to 2011. But I like, and we should be honest with that because it gets really bad in the beginning of Obama's tenure, which has made the irony of like liberal representative politics really profound, because I've looked at the numbers that hasn't recovered at all in this time period of the most focus on like campus style racial diversity, which just tells you from an objective level, even from what you say you want, what you are doing doesn't work. If it does anything, it does diversify things like the board of Harvard, which, yes, now has a lot of people of color, although not a lot of black people on it, but it does have, I think, one or two. But that does not change anything for the vast majority of even black people, much less people in general, right? It is not, but, you know,
I mean, I guess, you know, I'm interested what you think about like the fate of the intellectuals of your generation, because
what intellectuals of my generation? No, I mean,
yeah, it was very clear from, you know, like I guess it became clear to me, you know, on the one hand, like, you know, like even producing these books, right? Mm-hmm. You know, even though I'm not like exactly trained to do this, you know, I got to go to graduate school, right? Mm-hmm. in like a big way. And so did, you know, a lot of my the sort of core cohort of platypus around the University of Chicago, James Vaughn, Sunit, Chris, mm-hmm. right? We were all there, and we had a lot of patience, and yet, you know, we experienced like very clearly like this left academic thing, like it can't go on, like we're not going to get these jobs, like this thing is like ossifying in a certain way. But you know, your generation like didn't, like, I think it in a salutary way, like experienced right up front, like we have to develop like a new way to be intellectuals. Mm-hmm. Like the academic left is not going to be available to us. Like I see the people who've tried to do that of your generation, they're pretty unimpressive. Like they're like activist scholars,
which has been a mitigated disaster for both activism and scholarship. And which,
right, like for me, like you're going to be a scholar, you got to be a scholar. Like you're going to, you know, obviously, like I write books like that, right? I don't.
There's a division of labor for a reason, together.
Right? Yeah, there is, and you know, Wissenschaft is Wissenschaft,
right?
And you know, but of course, professors haven't produced the most important books in the history of the left, right?
No,
obviously, you know, being a failed professor as a, you know, or being outside, going to journalism, right? Getting a PhD, but not getting a job like Karl Marx, or Gerd Lukács or whomever. All right. There's a long history of left intellectualism, right? That I feel like your generation looked at, like even your, you know, interest in Lash, you know, is expresses that, you know, and yet, you know, I don't see like just in terms of like, okay, what are you going to teach a succeeding generation? Like, what are you going to make of your experience to be an intelligentsia? It's a real crisis, you know, and you're closer to those, you know, to that dynamic than I am.
Well, what I see with the Gen Z young people is that there's a general rejection of all narratives, but actually leads them to be easy prey for very easy narratives.
Right. Obviously, all this really degraded Marxist-Leninism.
Yeah, it's lately I've been like, you guys are insulting your own tradition here, like, which is hard for me to say, but like you're not even being self-honest with that. It's just usually verbiage from literally it's like Lacerdo, it's like Michael Parenti, who wasn't even formally a Marxist-Leninist, honestly. That's another irony of all this. It's like pretending.
Lacerdo is just a pox on humanity. I can't believe that people read this garbage. I guess you're saying he's like the best of what they read, or
yeah, he is actually. That's the thing. He's the one who's actually kind of a scholar. Right. And then what you get from the rest of it is like, these people can't even understand that, for example, defending 1938 USSR and 1987 CPC under Deng, you're in self-contradiction, or like arguing that you need to hold to the Stalinist text of 1952 while also arguing that you need to maintain third periodism. I'm like, you actually can't do that. You don't understand your own position. And the context for those positions, as degenerated as I find a lot of them, are lost on them. It's just completely lost. And there's this want, I guess, because they feel cheated by bad education and like vulgar anti-communism or whatever, to just invert those narratives, to just flip them. And
where is the vulgar anti-communism? I mean, I don't
not anymore. I guess it's like the Tea Party calling the Democrats communist in 10 years ago. That's these people's primary trauma, which I find kind of funny. But
because this is not a generation that rebels, like,
no,
against it. Like, it's not like you're telling your parents to fuck off by saying I'm a communist.
No, actually, that's something that I even have trouble understanding while we're talking about this generational shift. I mean, we're really off topic now, but I'll like the amount of continuity between generations, even though there is a real experiential gap between like Boomer and Gen X and younger millennial and Zoomer kids. Like, there's a massive technological gap, but there's not really a social gap at all, which to me, and people say, oh yes, there is. I'm like, really? I don't see it. And a lot of the values rebellion seems to be at the level of identity, but not in a way that actually changes how you communally organize yourself or have a community or any of that. And that's a very controversial thing to say, but it is like, no, these kids are alienated. They don't even really date much. Like,
I know.
And these are sociological facts that when you present look, these are the sociological facts that you are presenting of yourselves. Like, this is not, people aren't assuming this about you. These are the surveys answers that you give in private. And you don't like them, but you also you want to overthrow everything and nothing. And that's, there is a kind
I agree with you that, in a very broad way, the world is the same.
Right.
For every living, every generation that's alive today has lived the same life. That, we basically are, another way of putting that is that we are in the world of the new left, right? Our problem is that the socialist tradition, to come back to a little more square leftist conversation, that the socialist tradition, however we understand it, in terms of Stalinism or, generalized crisis of Marxism that, you know, many good members of communist parties, you know, resisted, etc. Nevertheless, it lay in ruins in the post-war period, and, you know, with the possible exception of the United States and Britain, that there was this decimation of socialism in Europe. There was this strange thing, of course, the Soviet Union, but there was a project that especially the American New Left faced that was inherited from that situation, which was, you know, if we're going to reorganize capitalism from here, right? If the UN and the World Bank are going to be in New York and Washington, then we need to reorganize the global socialist movement from here, right? That there was a task that of course faced the whole world, but that, you know, perhaps the American left was crucially placed to address, and to a degree did, right? It rose to that occasion in an important sense in the civil rights movement, which I will always argue is the core event of the New Left globally, and is the most inspiring event and is the most destabilizing event for the world state, because it attacked the key pillar of the world state, the Democratic Party. And I think that, and this gets to your question of like repetition. It has its roots in, you know, it has its roots in the 30s. It has its roots in a deeper history for sure. You know, where did that decimation of the left come from? Well, it came from the failure of the left. But, you know, we have to face this. You know, we don't have like the problem of Stalinism exactly. Like, and I think to an important way, like Stalinism had to be given like a shot in the arm by the New Left because it was dying on the vine. Like, they weren't looking at a world that was full of already organized communists, really, right? Those parties were very weak, even though they were mass parties around the world. And I think that this is why I said, you know, it's important that at least you and I are in our different ways, you know, with our many differences, you know, here to address this history and to highlight this question of repetition, because it does circle back to how do you address the ruin of socialism, if only to move past it, you know, if only to move past it.
Right.
Like, I just feel like we haven't moved past it.
We haven't even, I feel like we haven't acknowledged it, like, which is the, in some ways, I feel like we were more honest about this 20 years ago about the socialist, you know, the 20th century was a disaster for socialism. And now there's more of a, well, we'll find wherever we can find the cracks, and like, no, that really wasn't a disaster. Look at this, and this. And I'm like, well, every time you do that, you're having to, you know, like you said, grace necessity, like by saying, well, this had to be the way it was. But fundamentally, structurally, I just want you to realize that's a conservative argument. I could easily make that about any society, anywhere, ever. Like, so what's the significant difference of what you're offering? And the answer is not a lot. Furthermore, the societies that you're celebrating have all had to make concessions and integrate to the best of their own ability into, you know, the capitalist world system, to use that kind of phraseology, or the capitalist totality, to use a kind of probably older and more accurate phraseology. And because of that, you don't really have anything other than what you're projecting onto other struggles and whatever, you know, elsewhere. Everything is always elsewhere, actually.
I feel like it's a question of like, okay, maybe it was all necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I feel like, well, that's a task. Like, let's make the whole 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st century necessary by making it a long period of figuring out the project of world socialism. Right? Maybe it took all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe it took all of these generations, but only if we're addressing the manifest task. Like this gets to the issue, like we're not past socialism. You can't say it's necessary because we're clearly evading the necessity. Right? That's driving a kind, you know, it's the evasion of that necessity that's driving the forgetting, you know, the self-stupefaction. Like it's not that young people are dumb or not good enough or whatever. It's that the evasion of the task requires you to forget, requires you to distort, requires society to regress. Right? And that's where I feel like you know, let's make this kind of slow, you know, like I feel like we're all facing like the disintegration of capitalism.
Right.
And I'm like, God damn it, let's prosecute it. Like, you know, if capitalism is a crisis-ridden system, if it's got tendencies to break down, then let's fucking prosecute that breakdown. Like the breakdown of capitalism is a utopian potential. If we could realize the politics that could make that happen, right? That could actually make the disintegration of capitalism lead to something else other than more capitalism. Right. I hear it's like these people talk about political economy and like the big crisis. And I'm like, it's just more capitalism. Like that's, you know, that the reason it's a crisis is not because there's this, you know, this statistic or that statistic, this unemployment, you know, whatever. It's a crisis because we don't have anything to answer it.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that challenge where we should leave today. But yes, I think you're correct.
Anyway, I appreciate you having me on, Derek, and I hope that I can get some paperbacks of these books out, so that your listeners who doubtless can't afford them can sometime. In the meantime, make sure that, you know, everyone should make sure your library gets these books, right? So even if you won't read them, you know, some poor 18-year-old might, you know. And more generally, I would say, you know, that I think you and having me on, the question of the question of the self-education of those who were touched by the left of the last 2 decades. Young people or not so young people now, you know, you have to realize that it's on you, right? It really is, in the sense that you can't rely on Jacobin or even, you know, you, Derek, or me, or anyone else, right? That it is time for people to actually, you know, shit or get off the pot, in the sense that, you know, okay, fine, you don't want to be an intellectual, you know, but don't turn it into like I feel like people are turning these things into like an endless conundrum.
Right.
You know, I hope they listen to you, you know, let them listen to you every day. That's great. But let people study, you know, let them bring something to listening to you, and listening to others, listening to me. You know, I think that it's very distressing to imagine that that the whole library is just going to fall to dust.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, absolutely. But my challenge is always like, do something with this. Just listening to this as a passive form of entertainment is not useful even to you. So, you know, the listener.
Right. I hear you struggle with your own listeners in that way.
Yeah, I do. Because I see this as a pedagogical kind of like, you know, a little bit like what you guys are doing, but on a smaller scale, as a pedagogical intervention, because I'm not foolish enough to believe that this kind of media could ever be a proper political intervention in and of itself. Could help one if one existed, but and people like, oh, it does exist. Really? When, you know, like, are you going to tell me the squad is really your vision of any of this or anything like that? No, it doesn't exist yet. So, you know, that's where we're at. But if you don't do anything with it, then you help me pass a couple hours a day. But this is not my primary job, so it doesn't even matter for that purpose.
One of the things that I try to do with Sublation, I was so disappointed about, is trying to get, you know, the detritus that is the left to talk to itself and to debate, and you know, maybe that was chimerical. I really don't know. I can never, you know, I'm still puzzled. I don't know what you think, but I can't determine whether I just attempted that project with the wrong people or if it was doomed. You know, that there's no way for people to, you know, because what we're talking about in terms of like drawing lessons or trying to crystallize a historical conception of the present, which really requires us to confront the millennial left, I think. It's got to be contentious, right? I mean, how could it be otherwise? You know, I try to you know, in my own humble way, to steer a publication project in the direction of controversy and debate. You know, which I feel like Platypus prepared me for in a certain way, because it prepared me for a sense of like the breadth of the left and all the disagreements on the left. But I didn't think was like a paraplatypus thing or like a crypto platypus thing. I thought it had its own logic, you know, as a kind of whatever more political, direct strategy, debate, etc. kind of question. That depressed me too. You know, and I in the podcasting space, it feels like debate or disagreement is maybe harder to have. I don't know what you think.
It is, because what people will,
I guess you and Doug are like a notorious.
Yeah, we have debates. But in general, it's harder to have because the audience says they want it, but they don't reward it. And a lot of people have to follow their audience. Like there is an incentive structure here to give your audience what they want. And by that, they usually mean confirmation bias, which is a very, and I mean this in the negative sense of the word, because I don't use liberal as a swear word anymore. I don't think that's wise or fair or accurate. I think that misses the kind of good part of the dialectic within liberalism. But there is a sort of liberal as in like as in like sovereign individual self-flattery element to the way that political media, all political media, but particularly marginal political media, which all the left is, there's right-wing counterpoints to it, but all the left is, because it has no relationship to power, can be given towards,
obviously,
can be given towards self-flattery. And if you make your living off that, it's very, very hard to do. And yet, conversely, it's very hard to devote enough time to it to do it well if you don't make your living off of it. And that is not to excuse it. I mean, I think there's no excuse for the lack of debate and the lack of contention and the lack of standing up to people, including your own audience. And also, there's also no reason not to talk to people who you might disagree with because of some fear of contamination, unless you really just think they're stupid, like that there's nothing to be learned from the discussion. And that is seemingly where a lot of people are at right now, is particularly after Trump, the call for ideological consensus because of fascism, in quotation marks, has never been more pronounced. And yet, a lot of these people who were claiming 3 years ago that we were going to overthrow borders and police and whatever are now very silent on that. And also because the kind of faith in what they wanted to do was also this very state-centric thing, while also calling for the abolition of just selective parts of the state, which would never be viable. Like, it's not possible to maintain parts of this state and not other parts of the state in the way that you want to do it. And I mean, you even had politicians in office pretending that it could be, and they knew they were pretending. And that kind of like self-flattery is disastrous towards any movement. I mean, it's been disastrous on the political right in the past too. But the left tasks itself with something different than the right, as I always tell people. Like, you're not the right's task is either to go back to the past or maintain the current order. Your task is a taller charge, and when you fail, they win, even if they don't seem to win. Like, because in some ways they're invested in the status quo. And the thing that I've come to realize is a lot of the left is also some way invested in just parts of the status quo, and it thinks it can pick that selectively, right? Like, and
well, I just tell my, of course, I just tell my students all the right is discarded projects of the left.
mm-hmm.
There really isn't such a thing as the right's project. It's very confusing for people, obviously. But I thought that you had to have writing, that the debates had to be informed by like a vital world of publishing, and of course like periodical publishing, and that in a sense, one of the things that I was trying to explain to Doug Lane, that I was kind of pushing with Doug, is that, like, look, our only success would be to get the most out of the decline in this moment. Mm-hmm. Right? That, like, we can't, like, the kind of hits and the kind of viewership and whatever existed in the past, right? Those days are gone. I guess I'm thinking about this because I'm about the first anniversary of starting that crazy project. And that we have to, and I worry that, basically what I worry is that we aren't making the most of this depressing moment. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, to me, I guess it's because of my age, maybe. I'm not exactly sure that I ever thought that the wave wouldn't crest and recede. Right? I thought, like, because I was a child of the 80s and 90s, mm-hmm. I thought, well, there's so much like inertia here that, like, the millennial left is not going to overcome it. But the question is whether it could create a context or a kind of, points of leverage, handholds, to begin to move it. And I've tried to keep faith with this entire trajectory in terms mm-hmm. of what I could do on the left. Obviously, for me, a lot of that meant platypus. But now I feel like there is like a kind of a final phase,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like they're like tasks now. And of course, I think that for platypus, and I argue this point within platypus, that we have to, you know, there's a task that still exists for us as an organization. It's debatable, but I think it's still there. And that's why I'm interested in this question of like writing the history, having a last, you know, like what is going to be the last word on this trajectory? Like what, and it gets to this Zoomer question, right? Who is going to orient this generation that's emerging, that's going to be dealing with all of these aging Gen Xers and millennials running the world, that's going to tell them, like, here's a coherent story for understanding how we've gotten here and what the task is, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like one of the most disappointing things, this, you know, to come back to the beginning of like who's writing the history of your generation, one of the great abdication of the millennials to me is not only like the way that they conducted themselves, but like the refusal to reflect upon it in the end.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I guess that's a call for reflection. And on that note, we will wrap up. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Derek.
Let's
go. All the best.
You too.